A massive freezing hand shot upward. It clamped around the guard's wrist with the stopping power of a steel vice. Caleb Thorne opened his eyes.
Take your hands.
Caleb rasped his voice, a gravelly, ruined whisper.
Off my family.
The Thorne estate was always cold. It wasn't the thermostat. It was the silence. Clara Higgins knelt on the imported hardwood floor, her thick fingers gently tucking a heavy-knitted wool blanket around 7-year-old Leo. Her black and white maid's uniform was tight across her broad shoulders and wide hips, a constant, uncomfortable reminder of her exact place in this sprawling, empty house. Leo didn't speak. He hadn't uttered a single word in the 2 years since his mother passed away. But his dark, deeply observant eyes tracked everything. He gripped the edge of the wool blanket, pulling it closer to his chin, and leaned into Clara's soft, radiating warmth. She didn't mind the extra weight. For Leo, she was the only safe harbor in a house built on grief. Heavy measured footsteps echoed in the hallway. Caleb Thorne stopped in the doorway. He was a towering, weathered man, a former Navy SEAL who moved with a quiet, guarded grace. He was barefoot on the freezing floorboards, seemingly immune to the winter draft, rolling off the frozen lakes outside. A jagged, pale scar ran down his left forearm, disappearing beneath the rolled-up sleeve of his dark thermal shirt. His gaze swept the room tactical and detached before resting on Clara and his son.
His tutor arrives at 4,
Caleb said. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble.
Yes, Mr. Thorne. I have his books ready.
Clara replied, keeping her voice steady. From the hallway behind Caleb, a senior housekeeper, a thin woman with a sharp face, muttered something under her breath. A cruel, quiet remark about the help taking up too much space on the floor. Caleb didn't turn his head, but his posture instantly locked into something rigid and dangerous.
If I hear another whisper in this hallway,
Caleb said, his tone dropping to a dead quiet calm that made the air feel heavier.
You will be walking down the mountain. Clear.
The housekeeper gasped and scurried away. Caleb looked back at Clara. For a fraction of a second, the impenetrable frost in his eyes fractured. Clara saw the profound, bone-deep exhaustion hiding underneath. He wasn't a cruel man. He was a man trapped in a prison of his own making, completely terrified of failing the only family he had left. He protected her dignity the same way he protected this house from a distance. He opened his mouth, perhaps to say something else, when a horrific sound shattered the quiet afternoon. The frantic, high-pitched screech of tires skidding across black ice. It was followed immediately by a heavy, sickening crack and the sound of metal violently plunging into the frozen lake outside their window. The sound was deafening. A hollow, terrifying crack that vibrated through the floorboards of the estate. Caleb didn't flinch. He didn't shout. His SEAL instincts took over in a fraction of a second. He bolted down the hallway, tearing open the heavy oak front doors and sprinting barefoot into the biting November snow. Clara rushed to the window, pulling Leo with her. Down at the edge of the property, where the frozen lake met the tree line, a local school transport van had skidded off the icy road. The rear tires were already sinking into the black, freezing water. The thick ice was giving way, rapidly swallowing the heavy metal. Caleb didn't wait for the first responders. He stripped off his thermal shirt, his heavily scarred back exposed to the freezing wind, and dove straight into the shattered ice. Clara gasped, her hands trembling, as she pulled Leo's wool blanket tighter.
It's okay, Leo. Your dad is strong. He's going to get them.
For 3 agonizing minutes, the black water churned. Caleb surfaced, hauling a terrified teenage driver onto the thicker ice, pushing him toward the shoreline. But as Caleb turned back to check the sinking cab, a massive sheet of broken ice shifted violently, collapsing over the hole. Caleb disappeared beneath the surface. Leo mouthed the word, "Daddy," silently, his small fingers digging desperately into Clara's apron. By the time the local fire rescue team arrived, the lake was a graveyard of floating ice. It took 2 divers to finally locate Caleb. They dragged his massive, lifeless frame onto the snowbank. His skin was a terrifying shade of ash, his lips violently blue. He wasn't moving. Clara immediately dropped to her knees. She pulled Leo into her soft, heavy chest, burying his face in the thick wool blanket. She wrapped her large arms completely around the boy, shielding him from the traumatic sight of his invincible father looking like a corpse.
Don't look, sweetie.
Clara whispered, her voice cracking as tears stung her eyes.
He's just cold. Daddy is just cold.
The frantic wail of ambulance sirens tore through the freezing night. The fluorescent lights of Highland Park Memorial Hospital's ICU were blindingly bright. Trauma Bay 4 was a storm of frantic motion. But at the center of the chaos, the steel table was perfectly still. Dr. Elias Harrison, the chief of emergency medicine, stood over Caleb's icy body. Harrison was a man of machines and protocols, visibly irritated that his pristine trauma bay was being soaked by freezing lake water. He glanced at the monitors, his face an impassive mask.
Core temp is 68 degrees.
A nurse shouted over the din.
And no palpable pulse, pushing another round of epimycin.
Clara stood trembling in the corner of the room, her arms wrapped tightly around Leo. Her heavy maid's uniform was soaked through at the knees from kneeling in the snow, but she refused to leave the boy's side. The hospital staff had shoved them to the absolute margins of the room, treating Clara like an inconvenient obstacle. Then the heavy double doors swung open again. Eleanor Vance, Caleb's former mother-in-law, stepped into the ICU. She wore a tailored cashmere coat and a perfectly neutral expression. There were no tears in her sharp, calculating eyes. She didn't rush to comfort her grandson. She looked directly at the lifeless man on the table, her mind seemingly already sorting through trust properties and custody arrangements. A high-pitched, continuous drone suddenly pierced the room. The electrocardiogram monitor leveled out into a jagged, relentless flatline.
Hold compressions?
Dr. Harrison barked. The room fell into a terrifying silence, broken only by the steady shriek of the flatlining machine. Clara felt her own heart drop. She stared at the monitor, then down at Caleb's pale, motionless chest. Beside her, Leo fiercely tugged at her wet apron. Clara looked down. The 7-year-old boy wasn't crying. His dark eyes were locked on his father. He shook his head sharply, pointing a small, trembling finger at the steel table. He was silently insisting on a truth no one else believed. Clara's breath hitched. She looked back at the trauma team. They were giving up. Dr. Harrison let out a heavy sigh, stepped away from the table, and slowly began pulling off his wet latex gloves. Dr. Harrison dropped his wet gloves into the biohazard bin. The plastic snap echoed loudly in the sudden heavy silence of the trauma bay. He looked up at the digital clock mounted on the tiled wall.
Time of death.
Dr. Harrison announced, his voice flat and heavily practiced.
11:42.
Clara felt the floor tilt beneath her. She sank lower against the wall, pulling Leo tightly against her chest so he wouldn't have to watch a nurse pull the heavy white sheet over his father's face. Leo's small hands gripped her wet apron with desperate, trembling force. He pressed his face into her shoulder and let out a single broken sob, a raw sound of pure heartbreak from a boy who had sworn himself to silence. Across the room, Eleanor Vance didn't shed a single tear. She simply nodded, pulled a sleek phone from her cashmere coat, and stepped out into the hallway.
Yes, Charles?
Eleanor said, her brisk voice carrying through the open doors.
It's done. I need you to file the emergency custody paperwork for Leo immediately and freeze Caleb's accounts. I won't have the estate tied up in probate while we sort out this mess.
Clara felt a surge of absolute sickness. They were treating Caleb like a closed bank account, not a devoted father. She opened her eyes, looking past the retreating nurses to where Caleb lay on the steel table. The room was freezing. The air conditioning was blasting at full capacity to dry out the humidity of the lake water. Clara stared at Caleb's arm, which was hanging slightly off the edge of the bed. Something was wrong. In her 3 years of medical school, before her family's crushing debts had forced her to drop out and clean houses, she had studied environmental trauma. She looked closely at Caleb's exposed skin. It was pale, yes, but there was no livor mortis, no purple pooling of blood at the lowest points of his body. His muscles weren't locking into the rigid stiffness of death. He was just frozen. Her mind raced back to a specific lecture on extreme cold exposure, the mammalian diving reflex, severe bradycardia. When the core temperature drops too fast, the brain shuts down the body to protect the vital organs, slowing the heart rate to a crawl that standard machines can't easily detect. Clara's breath hitched. She stared at the flatlined monitor, then back to Caleb's broad, icy chest.
He's not dead.
Clara whispered the realization, hitting her like a physical blow.
Nobody is dead until they are warm and dead.
Clara knew she had only minutes before the morgue transport team arrived, or worse, before Eleanor Vance's lawyers descended on the hospital to claim the boy. She looked down at Leo. The child was shivering, not from the ambient temperature, but from profound, paralyzing shock. Clara scanned the chaotic hallway and locked eyes with a young pediatric intern she recognized from Leo's past checkups, a quiet, kind girl who had always treated them with basic human respect. Clara rushed over, gently guiding Leo into the intern's arms.
Take him to the pediatric family room on the 3rd floor.
Clara instructed, her voice dropping to a fierce, urgent whisper.
Keep him wrapped in this wool blanket. Do not let Eleanor Vance take him. If she tries, tell her hospital protocol requires a social services representative for emergency custody transfers. Just buy me some time.
The young intern looked terrified, but she nodded, wrapping her arms protectively around the silent boy. Leo looked back at Clara, his dark eyes wide and searching. Clara offered him a single reassuring nod. I won't let him go cold, Leo, I promise. Clara turned back toward Trauma Bay 4. Through the reinforced glass, she could see Caleb lying abandoned on the steel table. The medical staff had cleared out to attend to the teenagers he had pulled from the bus crash. They had left the air conditioning blasting at full capacity, essentially treating the room like a temporary morgue cooler. It was a fatal mistake. Clara's mind raced through her old trauma pathology textbooks. At a core temperature of 68 degrees, cellular oxygen demand plummeted. The brain could survive for hours without damage. The heart hadn't stopped. It had just slowed to a microscopic crawl. 1 beat per minute. Maybe 1 beat every 2 minutes. It wasn't generating enough electrical voltage to trigger Dr. Harrison's standard EKG pads. They were freezing him to death under the guise of pronouncing him dead. Clara looked down at her soaked heavy maid's uniform. She had spent years apologizing for her size, hiding in the background, making herself completely invisible to the wealthy elites who employed her. But right now, her natural body heat was the only biological defibrillator that could actually save him. She didn't hesitate. Clara stepped quietly back into the freezing trauma bay, pushed the heavy metal doors shut behind her, and threw the manual steel deadbolt. Click! The heavy steel deadbolt slid into place with a definitive echoing thud. Clara was entirely alone with the man everyone else had abandoned. The ambient temperature of Trauma Bay 4 was brutally cold, easily dropping into the mid-50s. The industrial air conditioning unit hummed above, actively working against whatever faint spark of life remained inside Caleb Thorne's body. Clara knew she didn't have time to scour the hospital for specialized blood-warming bypass machines. By the time she found one, his brain would actually begin to die. She stepped up to the steel table. Caleb's broad, heavily scarred chest was completely still. His skin was like marble, freezing to the touch. Clara took a deep breath, her hands shaking as she reached for the collar of his soaked thermal shirt. She pulled the freezing fabric over his head and tossed it to the floor. His bare chest was a canvas of faded military trauma, but right now it was a terrifyingly quiet landscape. If she was going to restart his system, she needed to apply maximum uninterrupted thermal energy directly to his core. For her entire life, Clara had been hyper-aware of her size. She was a large, heavy woman who had spent years trying to make herself smaller, trying to take up less space in a world that demanded perfection. But as she looked at Caleb's massive, freezing frame, she realized the sheer volume of her body was the only biological advantage that could save him. She was a living, breathing furnace, and right now she was running hot on pure, unadulterated adrenaline. Clara climbed onto the surgical table. The heavy metal legs groaned slightly under her substantial weight. She didn't hesitate. She lay down directly beside him, maneuvering her large, soft body so she was pressed entirely against his freezing side. She threw one heavy leg over his draped, her thick arm across his bare-scarred chest and tucked his icy face against her warm, fleshy neck. He felt like a block of ice. The sheer cold radiating from his skin sent a violent shiver down Clara's spine, but she gritted her teeth and pulled him tighter.
I've got you, Caleb.
Clara whispered, her warm breath hitting his icy jaw.
I'm not letting you go cold.
She wrapped herself around him like a heavy-heated weighted blanket, sandwiching him between her soft curves and the mattress, violently minimizing his exposure to the freezing air. Then she shifted her weight, placing her large, calloused hands squarely over the center of his chest. She threw her considerable upper body weight into a deep, heavy chest compression. 1, 2. She wasn't doing standard frantic CPR. She was acting as a mechanical pump for his sluggish heart, forcing the blood she was aggressively warming from his core out to his freezing extremities. 3, 4. 20 minutes passed, then 40. The sheer physical exertion of performing continuous heavy compressions in a freezing room was agonizing. Clara's shoulders burned with lactic acid. Her black and white uniform, already soaked with melted snow, was now clinging to her skin, drenched in her own sweat. Her heavy thighs cramped against the hard, unforgiving steel of the surgical table, but she refused to shift her weight. She kept her broad, boiling hot body draped entirely over his icy torso, aggressively fighting the ambient temperature of the room.
Come on, Caleb.
She rasped her throat raw. Tears spilled down her flushed cheeks, dropping onto his pale, scarred collarbone.
You don't get to leave him. You don't get to leave me.
She pressed her face against his icy neck, her voice breaking into a desperate private whisper.
You were the only one in that massive house who didn't look right through me. Do you know that when the rest of this town treated me like I was taking up too much space, like I was just a joke in a maid's uniform, you made sure I was safe? You demanded I be respected. You are a good man. You don't get to be just a memory, Caleb. Leo needs his father, and I need you to wake up.
A sudden violent pounding shattered the quiet of the trauma bay.
Open this door immediately!
Dr. Harrison's muffled voice barked from the hallway. The heavy metal rattled violently as someone threw their shoulder against it.
Security is here. We are breaching the lockstep away from the body. Charles, up boy. Shout. Sure.
Clara gritted her teeth, ignoring the terrifying noise. She drove her calloused hands down into the center of his chest again, her muscles screaming in protest. 1, 2. She flattened her ear directly against his bare sternum, squeezing her eyes shut as she braced her weight for another compression. She paused. She held her own breath. Beneath the thick muscle and the faded military scars, there was a sound. Thump. It was faint. It was incredibly slow buried, deep beneath the thick muscle of his chest, but it was unmistakable. Clara froze her hands, hovering just millimeters above his skin. She stared blindly at the scarred collarbone beneath her chin, holding her own breath, terrified that her exhausted pulse was playing tricks on her. 10 agonizing seconds passed in the freezing room. Thump! Stronger this time. Suddenly, the high-pitched continuous drone of the electrocardiogram stuttered. The flat green line on the monitor jerked upward, forming a jagged, beautiful spike. Beep. The machine finally registered the returning electrical current. The profound heat radiating from Clara's heavy frame had penetrated his core, breaking the biological hibernation of the severe cold shock. The warmed blood was moving again. Beneath her, Caleb's chest expanded. A sharp, ragged gasp tore through his pale lips, sucking in a desperate breath of the freezing air. His body shuddered against hers. Even in the dark, confusing haze of near death, his military instincts were waking up. He felt the heavy protective weight pinning him to the table. He felt the intense heat pressed against his frozen skin, and he registered the faint, familiar scent of the woman who always made his son smile. Bang! The heavy steel deadbolt finally snapped under the pressure from the hallway. The ICU doors burst open, rebounding violently off the walls. Through the gap, Clara briefly saw the pediatric intern struggling to hold Leo back. The 7-year-old was crying now, tears streaming down his face as he watched 2 hospital security guards rush into the room. Dr. Harrison stormed in right behind them, his face pale with shock and rage. He took one look at the chaotic scene, the heavy-set housekeeper drenched in sweat, desperately clinging to the supposedly dead body of the city's most formidable man.
What is wrong with you?
Dr. Harrison bellowed, pointing a shaking finger at the steel table.
Get that crazy woman off the corpse right now! Get her off him!
Dr. Harrison yelled, his voice cracking as he pointed at the surgical table.
Grab her!
The 2 hospital security guards lunged forward. Clara was completely physically spent. Her muscles trembled with exhaustion, her breathing ragged and heavy. When the first guard grabbed her upper arm, his fingers digging into her soaked uniform to haul her backward, she didn't have the strength to fight him off. She tried to anchor herself to the table, desperate to maintain the heat transfer, but the guard yanked her hard.
Let go of me.
Clara cried out, her voice raw.
He's breathing. Look at the monitor.
But Dr. Harrison wasn't looking at the monitor. He was blinded by his own shattered authority. Before the guard could pull Clara another inch, a massive freezing hand shot upward. It clamped around the guard's wrist with the stopping power of a steel vise. The room instantly plunged into absolute, terrified silence. The guard froze his eyes, dropping to the hand gripping his arm. The knuckles were white, the skin still terrifyingly pale, but the strength behind the grip was inhuman. Caleb Thorne opened his eyes. They were bloodshot, rimmed with the deep red of burst capillaries from the severe cold, but they were entirely lucid. The heavy protective fog of his near-death state had vanished instantly, replaced by the lethal hyper-focused instinct of a Navy SEAL, assessing a direct threat to his team. He didn't look at the doctor. He looked dead center into the eyes of the guard holding Clara.
Take your hands.
Caleb rasped his voice, a gravelly, ruined whisper that sounded like crushed glass.
Off my family.
The guard gasped instinctively, scrambling backward the second Caleb released his wrist. The man tripped over his own boots, backing into a medical cart. Dr. Harrison stood frozen in the center of the room. The color entirely drained from his face as he stared at the resurrected man on the table. The digital death certificate he had just mentally prepared evaporated. He took a stumbling step back, his mouth opening and closing without sound, realizing with creeping horror that he had just minutes ago ordered the morgue transport for a man who was now sitting up. A small blur of motion suddenly broke the tension. Leo had ripped away from the intern in the hallway. The 7-year-old boy darted between the paralyzed security guards, his heavy wool blanket dragging on the floor, and threw himself against the edge of the steel table, burying his face into Caleb's scarred arm. The chaos in Trauma Bay 4 dissolved into a stunned, heavy silence. Dr. Harrison backed away his medical authority, completely shattered, as the hospital administration scrambled to understand how a deceased patient was currently issuing quiet, lethal threats. Within minutes, Caleb demanded a secure phone. He bypassed the local staff, entirely contacting a specialized military medical team to oversee his immediate recovery. The freezing air conditioning was finally shut off. Warmed saline IVs were hooked up, and heavy thermal blankets were piled onto the steel table. Through the entire frantic process, Caleb refused to let go of Clara's hand. Clara sat heavily on a small plastic stool beside the bed, her soaked uniform clinging to her exhausted body. Her shoulders throbbed, and her palms were raw from the heavy chest compressions. Beside her, Leo stood on his tiptoes, his small hands wrapping fiercely around Caleb's opposite arm, refusing to move an inch. Caleb looked at his son, his thumb gently brushing a tear from the boy's cheek. Then his dark, tired eyes shifted to Clara. The lethal edge from moments ago was completely gone, replaced by a raw, unguarded vulnerability she had never seen in him.
You saved me.
Caleb rasped his voice, still a painful, gravelly whisper.
You were freezing,
Clara said quietly, looking down at their joined hands, her own insecurities suddenly rushing back.
I couldn't let you go. Leo needed you.
Caleb tightened his grip on her calloused fingers, forcing her to look at him.
I heard you, Clara.
Clara's breath hitched. Her heart hammered wildly against her ribs.
When I was trapped in the cold, I heard everything you said.
Caleb continued his gaze, locking onto hers with intense, unwavering honesty.
I didn't keep my distance because you were invisible to me. I kept my distance because every time I looked at you, my house finally felt like a home again. I was terrified that if I let you in, the world would find a way to take you away too.
Before Clara could process the profound weight of his confession, the heavy ICU doors swung open. Eleanor Vance marched into the room, a thick folder of emergency custody documents clutched in her manicured hands, completely oblivious to the fact that the man she was trying to bury was wide awake. Eleanor Vance didn't even look toward the steel table. Her eyes were fixed on the thick manila folder in her hands, her heels clicking sharply against the tile floor.
I don't know who gave you permission to remain in this room,
Eleanor said, her voice dripping with aristocratic disdain, as she finally looked up at Clara.
but your services are no longer required. You are a housekeeper, and a rather clumsy, oversized one at that. Did you really think hovering around a tragedy would elevate your station?
Clara felt a familiar sharp sting of humiliation. For years, she had let women like Eleanor make her feel small. She instinctively lowered her eyes, her shoulders slumping beneath her damp uniform. But before Clara could take a step backward, a small body moved. Leo stepped directly in front of Clara. The 7-year-old boy planted his feet gripping the edges of his heavy wool blanket and glared defiantly at his grandmother. He positioned himself as a tiny silent shield between the wealthy woman and the exhausted caregiver. Eleanor scoffed.
Move out of the way, Leo. Charles is waiting outside to take you to my estate. This woman is leaving.
She isn't going anywhere.
The voice was low-shattered and vibrating with absolute authority. Eleanor froze. The color instantly drained from her perfectly powdered face. The manila folder slipped from her manicured fingers, scattering legal documents across the wet floor. She slowly turned her head toward the hospital bed. Caleb Thorne was sitting up. The heavy thermal blankets were draped over his waist, exposing his heavily scarred chest. His eyes were dark, steady, and completely unforgiving.
Caleb.
Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling.
The doctor said...
The doctor was wrong.
Caleb said, his gaze shifting from Eleanor back to Clara. He reached out his hand palm up, waiting. Clara hesitated for only a fraction of a second before stepping forward and placing her calloused hand in his. Caleb's fingers closed around hers, anchoring her firmly to his side.
Look very closely, Eleanor.
Caleb commanded, the quiet steel returning to his voice.
This woman is not a maid. She is a trained medical professional. She is the person who dragged me back from the dark when your people left me to freeze.
He pulled Clara slightly closer, his thumb gently brushing over her bruised knuckles.
From this second forward, Clara answers to no one. She is the only woman who holds any power in my home. And if you ever speak to her like that again, you will never see my son for the rest of your life. Now get out.
Eleanor couldn't speak. She took one terrified look at the resurrected Navy SEAL and practically ran from the room. The heavy doors swung shut, leaving a sudden profound quiet in the trauma bay. Caleb let out a slow, tired breath. He looked down at his son. Leo was staring up at Clara, his dark eyes wide and shining with unshed tears. And then, for the first time in 2 years, the little boy opened his mouth. The trauma bay was perfectly silent. Even the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor seemed to fade into the background. Leo stood by the edge of the steel table, his small hands gripping the heavy wool blanket. He looked up at Clara, his dark eyes wide, before shifting his gaze to his father. His chest heaved with a sudden nervous breath.
Don't let her go!
His voice was fragile. It was a raspy, hesitant whisper, rough from 2 years of absolute, unbroken silence. But in the quiet room, it sounded louder than a gunshot. Caleb froze. His breath hitched in his chest. He stared at his son, the hardened, impenetrable armor of the Navy SEAL, completely shattering in a single second. A single silent tear slipped down his weathered face, cutting across the pale skin and fading scars.
I won't.
Caleb whispered, his voice thick with emotion.
I promise you, Leo, I'm never letting her go.
He reached out with his uninjured arm, wrapping it securely around his son, and lifted the small boy onto the edge of the bed. Leo instantly buried his face in his father's chest, wrapping his small arms around Caleb's neck. Then Caleb looked up at Clara. She was still standing a few feet away, her damp uniform clinging to her exhausted frame. Her hands were covering her mouth, tears streaming freely down her flushed cheeks as she listened to the boy she had cared for finally find his voice.
Come here.
Caleb said quietly. Clara didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, letting go of years of built-up insecurities and the deep-seated belief that she was meant to stay in the background. Caleb's arm wrapped firmly around her waist, pulling her flush against his side. He rested his chin against her shoulder, pulling her and Leo into a single, fiercely protective embrace. Clara rested her head against his, feeling the steady, strong rhythm of the heartbeat she had fought so desperately to restart. The room around them was still freezing, the linoleum floor still covered in melted snow, but Clara didn't feel the cold anymore. For the first time in her life, she didn't try to make herself smaller. She didn't worry about the space she was taking up. Wrapped in the arms of the man she had saved, and holding the little boy who had just called her home, Clara realized she wasn't invisible at all. She was the center of their world, and as Caleb pressed a quiet, lingering kiss to the side of her head, Clara finally knew she was exactly where she belonged. Did this heart-pounding medical rescue leave you breathless if you loved watching Clara risk everything to bring the Seal Dad back from the edge? Hit that like button right now. Share this incredible story of loyalty, survival, and unexpected love with your friends who crave real drama. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss out on our thrilling audio stories. Drop a comment below. What would you have done if you were in Clara's shoes?